All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the May 2026 Macroeconomics Hour seminar. We're really excited to see so many of you joining us. And of course, I'll make the recording available to other group members. So today we'll be talking about artificial intelligence related macroeconomic issues, including the threat of unemployment. And we'll talk a little about the February 2026 memo from Citrini Research, which actually shook the markets a bit. And so it's probably a good thing that we gave it a few months to kind of settle so that we can look at the issue from a more neutral viewpoint. And we'll also talk about the challenges associated with the evolution of taxation in the age of AI. So our plan today, and Hadi, let me know if I'm getting something incorrect, is as follows. So Hadi will talk about the potential tidbits from that Citrini Research memo and the criticism of the very apocalyptic predictions from that thought exercise. And so then I'll join, and we kind of did our analysis independently. So I'll give a bit of my view on the potential, some of the, from my perspective, what the potential, limitations of this thought exercise are, and what are the takeaways from it. And I'll talk both about the general principles of taxation, just to give you a flavor of what public finance folks are concerned about. And I'll talk about potential changes that may take place as a response to the increasing use of AI. So that's the plan. Does this sound right, Hadi?
Yes, so you're going to start, right?
Okay. So I could. I was so let me do that, and then I can transition to you,
Right,
so
right.
I can give sort of my 2 cents on that Citrini thought exercise, right?
Okay,
Okay. So let me
go
do
ahead.
that. Let me share my screen. Um, and let me start the presentation. Okay. So the picture, by the way, that you're seeing on our cover page, that's a pretty famous engraving showing Luddites, the leader of the Luddites. And Luddites, if you remember, was the popular movement that essentially was destroying technology in the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, right? And sort of Luddites are very much concerned about the loss of labor that came with automation and the potential negative impact on the population. But as you can kind of see, their fears probably were a bit overblown, right? Would be, sort of what came along as the result of the Industrial Revolution is essentially significant increases in incomes worldwide, especially for the countries who jumped in early to automation in the Industrial Revolution. And so to this day, sort of like if you call somebody a Luddite, right, sort of you're basically labeling somebody who is against the progress. But the recent concerns about AI are kind of bringing the same concerns to the forefront, right? So from this perspective, I thought it was an interesting thing to use. So we'll talk about the AI impact on employment, a potential AI apocalypse, possible changes in tax policies. And we probably could have put a lot more readings in the list, right? I try to not to overwhelm it too much, but we put that actual Citrini research memo that was partially generated with the use of AI, as I understand it. There is couple of articles from The Economist. And Economist just very recently, a couple of days ago, published an article where it's cautioning us to prepare for an AI jobs apocalypse, right? However, at the same time, if you look at a recent editorial by Ezra Klein in New York Times, he is reaching an opposite conclusion to The Economist. And I also put in a fantastic, very readable paper on the future of tax policy from the Brookings Institution. And it also links to additional research that could be interesting to review. And with that in mind, let me just give some of my takeaways on the Citrini research thought exercise. So I'm not necessarily describing this thought exercise itself, but essentially it's an apocalyptic issue. It's an apocalyptic scenario which depicts very quick adoption of artificial intelligence. The corresponding pressure on the AI productivity, because we expect that the AI productivity is going to increase considerably. And all of that results per this memo, which actually is set a couple of years in the future, right? That's a viewpoint that is being taken. What we are seeing is a boost in corporate profits, job destruction in general, cognitive labor. And so here, kind of like this is one of the important distinctions that we're talking not about specific industry, but we're talking about the generative cognitive labor in general, right? And sort of, I think this is important to emphasize. All of those things are leading to the lower aggregate demand because if jobs are being destroyed, then and a lot of those jobs, primarily those jobs, are well-paid white-collar jobs, right? So the prediction is that the white-collar folks could be experiencing something similar to what the blue-collar folks experienced over the last few decades. And so as a result of those layoffs, as a result of this job destruction, individuals start consuming less, that and even the folks who are still employed, they're essentially consuming less because they're seeing what is happening to their peers. And so if you expect that the future is not looking terribly rosy, how do you respond to that? You respond to it by saving more and consuming less, right? So if you have a lower aggregate demand, firms might respond to that with even more AI automation if there is additional pressure on profits, which that memo calls a feedback loop with no natural break, which is, by the way, quite arguable. Then in turn, this leads to significant disruptions to credit markets. And so this is very different from the disruption to credit market from 2007, 2009, because the issue was the low quality of mortgages that were issued. Now what we have is that the quality of mortgages is relatively high based on when those mortgages were extended. It's just that the future had changed and a significant number of people who were very good financial risks are no longer good financial risks. And something like that can lead to a financial contagion. And then there is a concern about traditional monetary policy no longer working as well as they used to. Because, sort of if the central bank decides to lower the interest rates, is it going to help very much in a situation related to this general financial contagion from loss of white-collar jobs and highly paid white-collar jobs? The criticism is that this monetary policy probably is not going to be as effective as it used to be. And so what I can do, and Hadi, let me know how you'd rather do that. Do you want to take over here and offer your criticisms, or should I run through my list of criticisms first?
Let me present my criticism of this research or the conclusions of the research, and then I'll pass the baton to you to finish the discussion. So let me share my screen. Okay. Okay, here we go. So let me first mention that in the long run, income per capita remains stagnant if you don't have any productivity enhancing technology. This is well-known fact from growth theory that ultimately growth of per capita income is dependent on increased productivity. And in that sense, if AI does not happen, a big chunk of future economic growth is not going to happen either. So that's a longer term positive in favor of AI. Okay, because we know already that it increases productivity tremendously. But we know also that some of these technologies may affect the majority of people who are low income or not very skilled or not endowed with uh, assets that use AI or generate AI services. Well, some groups are going to gain a lot, and majority may actually lose a lot relative to the people at the top. So this is the basis for criticism of AI, that it causes a bad distribution of income in favor of those who already have a lot, and it doesn't contribute to the livelihood of people who don't have a lot. So, and in the middle of, meanwhile, there's asymmetric impact of some new technologies like AI on the owners of capital versus labor, and that creates political tensions. Specifically because it's going to cause major shift in the distribution of income, as well as political power. Political power also is going to be concentrated in the hands of a few who control the AI generation and operation. As Vlad also pointed out, this could cause replacing workers with machines. It's going to make workers redundant. So that's the claim of critics of AI. But finally, individuals who control capital dominate the economy and politics. People more generally may be using AI, but not as effectively as those who have the skills. Then those who are left behind in terms of skills to either use or generate AI services, then the people with access are going to gain, and people without access to the technology or not being able to use the technology much are going to lose relative to the ones who benefit from the productivity enhancements brought about by artificial intelligence. So, to summarize, the critics of AI argue that a minority may prosper and the rest may perish. For seeing an example of such a thing, and what are the consequences, you may be interested in watching a movie called Snowpiercer, which is built on this idea of what would happen to the mass of people when they become redundant, and other issues in that movie. But it's a Korean movie and very well made. Now, an alternative way of looking at it, so this is the critique of the critiques of AI. When a new technology comes and raises productivity, final goods become cheaper. If the cost of production goes down, that's what high productivity means. You're using the same resources but can produce a lot more goods and services. So new technology generates much more goods and services, products, and the price of the products should go down as a result of that, or could go down. Of course, I'm going to come back and argue that there are conditions under which this is true. But that's the point, is that in the Citrini uh, argument, the fact that productivity lowers price is not taken into account. I think the assumption is that the technology is controlled in a monopolistic way. I'm going to come back to this in a moment. So, so in this sense, cheaper products relative to wages of workers means that standard of living might actually go up for those who are employed. Increased productivity of labor also encourages firms to hire more workers. If each worker who has a job can produce much more with the help of AI, then you have a situation where investment in AI may enhance the productivity of workers, and firms then are going to find it much more beneficial to employ more workers. Examples of these are the large companies that are using technology, new technologies, especially the information technology firms. A lot of them have grown quite large. It's not like, for example, Google has diminished as a result, or cut back on its employment and the number of jobs it offers in the long run, just because there's a technology that makes it cheaper to produce the services that it produces. As it invests in an asset or in an area, then discovers that it can produce the services less costly, more productively. Then it gets into a new area, goes to new areas and hires more workers to be able to sell to bigger markets and larger markets. So that could provide more services, more goods to the economy. So in the long run, everybody's welfare could be raised. In the short run, of course, frictions in the markets, and that could prevent the a more equitable distribution of the benefits of AI. And one needs to distinguish between these short-term imbalances versus long-term rise in economic growth. And let me finish the discussion by pointing out that there are negative and positive effects of a new technology. The new technology raises productivity and lowers prices in that sense, but at the same time may be replacing workers in some areas. But my argument is that, or counter argument against the critics of AI, is that while incomes rise, or maybe initially taken over by those who own the companies, who own the process that and control the process that produces AI technology, eventually there may be positive effects. Now, these positive effects, or whether the effect is positive or negative, depends on the situation. For example, a negative effect. A new technology comes and places a few firms in a monopolistic position. So they can actually set prices in a monopolistic way, and they gain, and the majority may not gain as much. So the inequality might actually increase as a result of this, because the firms will not allow product prices to go down. If the economy is competitive, then the price will go down as a result of higher productivity, and that could benefit a large number of people, and a lot more can be produced with the same resources in the economy. So whether the positive effects dominate the negative ones or vice versa depends on the conditions of the economy. It depends on the way the political economy works in the economy. And historically, we look at major technological changes, we see that eventually income has risen and has benefited everybody. Maybe some more, a little bit, in some cases, a little bit less, but generally progress in the economic production, in economic activities, result is it requires new technologies to come and raise productivity. In the short run, of course, there could be some imbalances. In the long run, I think everybody gains, some more, some less, but we should support such technologies. Some people say that you can just look back at the past. This time it's different. AI is different. I'm not sure, but I just wanted to bring to you some arguments why AI could be actually beneficial. And with that, I stop sharing and would like to listen to your comments and
All right.
suggestions.
Thanks very much, Hadi. So it's interesting that we are probably going to have some very common arguments in here, and some maybe that will be a little bit different. So, but you made such an interesting point about the importance of the industry's industrial organization, because that will make a huge difference, right? So Google benefited quite a bit from artificial intelligence. The interesting question, for example, remains to be how much Google's clients are going to continue benefiting. Because if you think about Google's clients, I mean, in some sense, the users of the Google engine are the product, and the real clients are the firms that sell advertising. And what we've seen, this is probably anecdotally, this is mostly estimates, is that once Google started using artificial intelligence to display summaries on their search pages, the click-through rate to the actual businesses and advertisers has decreased significantly, right? A lot of users will go to Google, they'll search for something, they'll look at the summary provided by Google, and won't look at anything else. So if your firm or your work was mentioned in that Google page, then you are actually more likely to get more click-throughs, but not so much for firms that don't show up on those AI search results that are generated by AI, right? Okay, but let me start sharing my screen and offer my criticisms in here, and sort of we'll see how much of an overlap we have. And so, from my perspective, the key issue here is that, number one, historically, productivity growth actually creates income in multiple industries, because we're looking not just at the industry that's doing particularly well as a result of technological progress. We're looking at everybody else who services these industries and their employers, and they typically benefit quite a bit. I also agree with Hadi that this article here emphasizes too much the lower wages themselves. If you look at the traditional microeconomic tools, so we are moving to the micro here from macro, there is such a thing as the income effect of lower prices. If you have an industry with significant competition that uses AI, what we can expect to see as a result of that competition is lower prices of those services. And those lower prices, even if you're making the same wage or you're potentially making less money, right? It's possible that your real income actually increases because your purchasing power has increased due to those lower prices. Another argument here is that AI is likely to replace parts of jobs, right? But not the entire jobs. Of course, there are probably plenty of examples, that they'll give you entire jobs being replaced. But generally speaking, if you try to disaggregate all of the things that you do, things that AI could replace accounts only for some of it, but not for all of it, and in many cases, not for the most of it. So that's an important stabilizer here in this process. I also think that this article was extremely optimistic about AI deployment, right? Sort of, this AI utopia is supposed to take place in 2028. And I think that's way too much optimism about how well this will. I think what we'll see is that for some firms, investment in the AI is going to be extremely positive, but there will also be a number of failures, related to that because some firms simply won't do it well, right? Then another example is that possibility of diminishing returns in AI use. And Hadi talked about this limitation as kind of the setting as the limitation that takes place when there is no technological progress, right? If there is no technological progress, if they're not increasing the productivity of capital, it will experience diminishing returns, right? And sort of on top of those diminishing returns, and the more capital you use, the more you suffer from potential depreciation and the need to replace it. And that's kind of like one of the key contributors to the importance of that technological progress. And I also think that this article probably underestimates the adaptability of institutions because I don't think that there is any government that will wait until the unemployment rate rises to 8 to 10%, and there are significant issues in the financial markets. I think most governments learned their lessons and they will start reacting much faster, but there also is going to be a lot of adaptability of people and firms in the private industries, right? So this is actually one of the key features of the markets, and that's why we like markets so much as economists, is that imagine the complexity and the millions, billions, trillions of tasks and economic transactions that take place every day. They take place without much in terms of coordination, but it's that invisible hand of the market that directs it going back to Adam Smith, and that invisible hand works extremely, extremely well. And so I'll mention this. There are also plenty of valid points in this memo. So if you look at some of the historical parallels, there is a phenomenon known in economics and political science as the Engels' pause, and this is named after Friedrich Engels of the Engels and Marx fame, the fathers of socialism and communism, I guess. So essentially, what we've observed for about 50 years from the early onset of industrial revolution to roughly middle of the 19th century, we've seen significant growth in productivity, but workers' wages were not keeping up with it. So basically, over those 50 years, productivity increased on average by almost 50%, but wages increased by only 12% or so. So the early returns certainly went to the industrialists, to the owners of the means of production. And that's I think something worth talking about, right? Eventually, workers caught up with that quite a bit, but 50 years, this is a very long period of time. I'm hoping that, there is a very good chance that there is going to be a similar adjustment, right? And hopefully that adjustment is not going to be 50 years long, right? But another valid point is that the white collar professions are going to change. So there will be adjustments in those specific jobs. There will be adjustments on the labor markets, meaning that if you are in a job that requires use of cognitive abilities, so there is going to be some supplementation by AI, right? And some replacement by AI, which means that those workers will find it more difficult to find new jobs and to obtain higher raises. And I suspect that the middle managers are going to be exposed to that quite a bit more. So that's a concern. I think another real concern here is the potential for higher income inequality and concentrated wealth, right? Sort of think about San Francisco, think about the Bay Area, where the folks who were at the beginning of the AI revolution and who have stock in the companies, they are likely, millionaires already. They will be multimillionaires in a few years. And so For them, there is this setting where a lot of their colleagues who are not as lucky as they are, they're making less money, but there is a subset of folks who have a lot more income and a lot more wealth compared to everybody else. And so there is going to be significant transition shocks in this process. And there will be a need to adjust some of the macroeconomic policies. And this is kind of what I wanted to dig in a little bit more and talk about both the general principles of taxation and how those principles might have to be changed. But meanwhile, let me stop for a moment and ask if there are any questions from our group. Feel free to unmute yourself and speak up if you'd like. Okay, folks are very silent. I don't know if it's a good sign or a bad sign, but let me go on and talk more about principles of taxation. And sort of this is my main field, as you know, sort of like my doctoral work was in public economics or public finance, right? And so this is always an interesting topic. So the first question is that why do governments engage in taxation? Why do we tax our citizens and our corporations? Even though, as Mitt Romney said, corporations are people too. Well, first of all, there is the issue of public goods. There are certain things that markets simply don't provide the optimal quantity of, right? So they may provide too many things, too many things that have negative externalities, and too few things that are considered to be classic public goods. So things like national defense, education, justice system, public health system, and so on and so forth, right? Sort of this is kind of like one of the key reasons why governments exist, to provide those public goods, right? We also use our taxes for the purposes of income redistribution, which flows from rich citizens to poor citizens. Taxes can serve as incentives for right behaviors and, well, disincentives for wrong behaviors. So if you look at the taxation of smoking, that's a negative incentive. If you look at subsidies to both R&D, research and development, and higher education or education in general, actually, these are incentives for the right behaviors. These are things that have externalities associated with them. And we want to disincentivize things of negative externalities and provide incentives for things of positive externalities. Taxes also act as macroeconomic stabilizers of sorts, right? So, you can kind of look at, sort of if the economy does poorly. So generally, sort of governments start taking in less money from taxes and they start spending more in terms of transfers. And all of those things will actually contribute to stabilizing the macroeconomic environment. However, at the very same time, taxes also have plenty of negative, sort of plenty of negatives, right? So first of all, and this is a big one from microeconomics, it's that concept of the deadweight loss. If you tax a certain behavior, you can expect to see some reduction in economic activity and some decrease in economic efficiency, right? And so what we're looking at here is a trade-off. And that trade-off of deadweight losses, by the way, is significant, right? Because it increases much faster than the increases in the tax rate, right? It actually increases at the, you can basically square that increase, right? If you're trying to model the impact of the size of the deadweight loss. Then also you have to keep in mind that legal incidence, meaning sort of who the tax is imposed on, is not actually equivalent to the incidence of taxation. For example, we know from microeconomics, whether you tax consumers or producers in a certain economic situation, the incidence of taxation or the pain of taxation is going to be shared by both consumers and producers. And the actual magnitude of that income is going to be dependent on the elasticity or responsiveness. So if people are, if certain behaviors could be are more elastic, more responsive, that means they are going to be associated with higher deadweight loss and lower incidence of taxation on that party, right? So the typical example here from the microeconomic textbooks would be the example of taxes on gasoline. If you implement a tax on gasoline, the demand is very inelastic because in the short run, you simply don't have a choice about how much you're going to drive your car. If you're able to adjust your behavior, it's going to be by very little. And that means that this non-responsive party, the consumers, will be paying for the majority of the taxes. And finally, and that's also a big one, administration costs of taxation can be extremely, extremely significant, right? So that's something else to keep in mind. Which means that when we are designing good tax systems and when they think about what the good tax systems should look like, well, first of all, they should be understood and accepted by population, right? There are countries where people kind of don't, view paying their income taxes as a national sport. Russia used to be one of those countries, and it probably is still one of those countries. I lived for a couple of years in Greece, and I remember my friends joking that tax evasion and tax avoidance were the unrecognized Olympic sport in Greece, where Greeks would probably get all of the medals, right? So a good tax system also has to be simple. A good tax system has to be relatively neutral unless the government, for some reason, wants to move away from neutrality. For example, in rewarding or encouraging development of certain industry. A good tax system has to be consistent, meaning that you want to avoid a situation where your tax system changes every year. Instead, you want to have a consistent tax system that businesses and individuals can use to engage in long-term planning because that introduces certainty. And that certainty means higher level of economic activity because it's the uncertainty more than anything else that kills business. A good tax system should be also difficult to both evade and to avoid. And of course, tax evasion is illegal. Tax avoidance is tax avoidance is legal, right? It simply describes how taxation system changes people's incentives, but generally evasion should be difficult. And what we prefer to see is to have a broad tax base, but have lower tax rates, right? That's been one of the key principles of what a good tax system looks like. And so also in the, from the perspective of having a workable system, normally the tax inelastic activity is heavier because they have fewer opportunities for people who participate in those activities to change their decisions, right? And what this has historically meant, and what we see in the evolution of tax receipts over the years, at least in the United States, is a lot more taxes coming from labor and a lot less taxes coming from capital. And so why is that? So in terms of labor, it's kind of difficult to hide your labor income given the reporting requirements that every company is subject to, right? And it's also kind of hard to change your behaviors. That's why we tax labor more. And for capital could be deployed relatively easily if you look globally and if you look at global competition between countries. There are fewer barriers to the movement of capital globally, which means that countries with lower tax rates on capital benefit significantly from it, right? Look at Ireland. Look at countries that essentially provide lower taxes on capital, and there we start getting into the tax, into the transfer games, transfer pricing games that the companies start playing because they start incorporating in those lower capital countries and they try to shift as much income as they can towards those countries, right? And that's a real limitation. And so the major debate generally in the good tax system, and a lot of those questions are essentially, this is not positive analysis. This is normative analysis. It's about what things should be. It's kind of like this trade-off at efficiency of the tax systems versus equity of the citizens put in those situations. And this is where major policy debates come in. They tend to concentrate on those normative issues, not necessarily on the positive issues, which is describing things as they are. And so as economists, of course, it's kind of hard to avoid normative analysis, but we try to concentrate on positive analysis more than anything else. And so, just to finish kind of like this short summary of taxation, keep in mind that the major types of taxes typically tend to be income from labor and from capital. There is also payroll taxes, such as Social Security and Medicare taxes. There are consumption taxes, and these are things like VAT in Europe. And Europe has traditionally relied a lot more on consumption taxes than the United States has. In the United States, the equivalent is the sales tax, but they kind of use sales tax as an issue for state governments and for local governments. This becomes a much larger part of their tax base compared to the federal governments. You could have excise taxes. You could kind of view tariffs as, a sort of a consumption tax as well. Then there are property taxes, which typically local governments get a lion's chunk of. There are corporate taxes that are not, sort of income taxes necessarily. And then there is wealth, estate, and gift taxes that also exist. And if you look at the way how tax distribution works in the United States, extremely heavy on labor, right? Again, keep in mind the limitation here is that I'm talking about the federal tax system only. If you look at the overall tax burden, it's going to be different because you'll have the property and consumption taxes incorporated there that come from the state and local governments. But at the federal level, again, really difficult to do this accounting, but roughly 70% of labor, 20% capital, 10% everything else. Okay. And as I said, consumption taxes are primarily local. And so, with this in mind, how would our taxation system have to change once, if AI becomes a lot more spread, and if we see at least some of the issues from the Citrini Research memo come up to light? Well, we recognize that it's a threat to the traditional tax base. We are seeing if this results in a lower demand for labor and higher demand for capital, it means that they'll have to rethink some of the approaches that we've used before. And what might those approaches be? And let me throw a few ideas out there. A lot of those ideas come from the Brookings Institution research paper, which I gave in the references and which I encourage you to review. It's relatively easy readings. But one idea is to increase consumption taxes on AI-provided services, things like cloud storage and cloud computing, streaming, AI agents output, AI-generated content in general, right? You could also have targeted production taxes on the means of production. And this is basically Bill Gates's idea, because Bill Gates had been saying for a very long time, I think it must be at least 15 years. I want to say, again, I mean, I remember him saying something as early as 2017. For some reason, I have even like 2012 in my mind. So it's possible that Bill Gates started talking about that much earlier. But his idea is that if automation replaces human labor, we should be applying a tax on those robots that should replace the taxes paid by the humans. And then governments can use those taxes to retrain workers, to provide general means of support that potentially could be source of revenue for universal income payments, right? Things like that. And so many people, when they hear about Bill Gates arguing for this, they tend to be very surprised. They expect actually the opposite. We have to also distinguish between intermediate taxes versus final taxes. Generally speaking, we want to avoid disrupting the economic activity too much. And from this perspective, we could make an argument that it's better to place more taxes on the final goods and services rather than place them on the intermediate inputs, or even on things like AI hardware, right? Because that creates significant disincentives to the progress of technology that could potentially make our lives better, right? That's a real that's a real consideration, right? We could also start going into more interesting systems where what we do is, I think this is kind of like a classical taxation of profits in their economic sense, right? Because remember, accounting profits are kind of the return that you made that your accountant tells you, right? Sort of this was your total revenue. You subtract your total costs. This accounting profit doesn't incorporate any opportunity cost in that computation. And the argument here is that if we look at the typical returns in the industry, right, at the average income, let's say your average income is equivalent to whatever, a 5% return to capital. If you have an industry that is heavy in AI, that actually generates higher economic profits and thus higher rents, we could figure out a way to tax what we could call this excess profit, right? This profit that sort of exceeds normal. Not necessarily a very easy thing to do, but potentially doable, right? You can kind of figure out like the framework. You could figure out, actually monopolization of some industry might be a plus here, because even though those monopolists are likely to spend money, arguing against such taxation programs, given that they're concentrated, it might be easier to tax, right? And in general, what we could argue for is maybe more use of progressive taxation, right? Even though progressive taxation tends to be a double-edged sword, right? If the marginal tax rates become higher, it becomes more likely that the businesses and individuals will engage in tax evasion and avoidance behaviors, right? And sort of from this perspective, that is kind of like a cost benefit game for businesses. And so maybe, sort of a better system here going to a simpler taxation system rather than more difficult taxation system. But generally speaking, what will probably have to happen if those predictions play out in any significant way, shape, or form is probably a move that will replicate the European taxation system a bit more, that is figuring out how to tax consumption more and potentially how to tax capital more. Remember, capital actually used to be extremely flighty, right? Sort of it's more subject to flight if the tax rates increase, right? But I think what actually goes for the argument of higher taxation of capital is, generally speaking, AI itself could offer better tools for governments to monitor behaviors like that, right? And so if they're able to monitor those behaviors and to increase the likelihood of getting caught in, if engaging in moves to, sort of move capital to lower jurisdictions and pay lower taxes on profits, I think that the governments could actually catch it much easier these days than they could, say, 10 to 20 years ago, when you were entirely relying on the understaffed Internal Revenue Service to do this sort of monitoring, right? Now with AI, that actual monitoring of people's tax behaviors might become a lot easier. We might be moving closer to this dystopian society, where the government knows everything about you, because after all, if businesses know everything about us based on our behaviors, then government probably could do the same thing as well. And this is what I have for my presentation, so I'll stop sharing and I'll take any questions or comments. So if I look at the chat, Ing, do you want to articulate your question?
Sure, Professor. Thank you for sharing the US tax system about how AI. I just wondering, can you provide some insights how other countries approach AI regulation and policy from a tax perspective?
Yeah. So I think kind of like the main comment that I could offer here is that there are a number of countries, and European Union tends to be a very strong example, but sort of like Russia is one, right, with the universal VAT tax rate on consumption. There are a number of governments who already tax consumption more and who tax capital more, and they tax population comparatively less, right? Sort of when they tax labor comparatively less. And so countries that engage in those behaviors, or that have made those policy choices, they might find it easier to respond to the AI threat, right? Kind of like the main challenge for the United States, from my perspective, is that the taxation of labor is so heavy because we knew that labor simply wouldn't leave the United States, right? It's very hard to hide your income. It's very hard to move somewhere else. If you look at capital, it was a lot more flighty. And so, generally speaking, from the federal perspective, there was simply no national VAT tax or no national sales tax. And what we might expect to see is a lot more of those taxes coming online, even though for countries who traditionally relied on that higher taxation of labor, like United States did, the adjustments might be a more difficult adjustment. All right. I know it's probably not a terribly good response in here, but it's kind of the general view on this perspective.
Thank you, Professor.
Uh-huh. Thank you. Any other questions or comments, folks? Anything else? What do what's your own take on that Citrini Research thought exercise? Do you think it's spot on? Do you think it's too apocalyptic? Do you think those concerns are overblown? What's your take? Happy to take your thoughts. We'd love to hear from you. All right, it's very quiet. Lots of room for thought. Hadi, would you like to offer any closing thoughts or arguments? You're on mute. Hadi, you're still on mute. We can't hear you.
All right, thanks for noting the mute. And very good points. And I just wanted to add that among developing countries, lower income countries, they seem to be just waiting to see what developed countries do and then decide how they want to engage. The idea of having a universal tax rate, at least part of the tax be set through agreement among countries of the world, that may be a solution to this because that then reduces the extent of movement of capital across borders just to avoid taxes. So it probably there's going to be there's a strong argument, and possibly even countries may go and start implementing some minimum tax rate that collectively countries agree on. It's probably going to start with G7, the top economies, and then expand to G20, and then expand to other countries as well. And
Hadi, just question about that. My sense is that the current administration is likely going to be opposed to those universal tax rates, right? Though the Democratic administration typically tended to be more receptive to that, right? Because I think it was on the Biden's administration policy docket, and there were a number of conversations about and some preliminary agreement signing about implementing those universal tax rates. But it's kind of like a good cartel in some sense, right? Because for smaller countries, there is always a very significant incentives to lower their tax rates just a bit, right? Or to find potential loopholes in their system so that you can attract more of that income, away from the developed countries of the universal tax rates. So I'm guessing a country like Ireland is probably not going to be very excited about that.
That's why a lot of companies in the US are registered in Delaware.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
A small entity in the economy as a whole has very, very low tax, but the volume that it gets of capital, it's going to be so high, and benefits of registering firms there, that it's worth its while to be home to many companies that probably have no one to represent them in Delaware.
That's right. The only presence there is that of a registered agent that sells potentially thousands of companies, right? It's just
Exactly.
one big mailbox.
Exactly. They have all the same address.
Yeah, that's exactly it. All right. Well, I'm sorry, Hadi, I interrupted you. Was there something
No,
else
no,
you wanted to mention?
that was my point. That
Hmm.
let me just add that the benefits of avoiding tax evasion by corporations might actually grow, keep growing, especially with AI.
Hmm.
Uh, right now, for example, AI centers in Dubai or United Arab Emirates
Hmm.
uh, seem to be a way of moving capital there, and there's no income tax in Dubai. So, and no corporate tax. So th those countries are very happy to just have uh, big companies come and invest in their
Hmm.
territory. As a result, there may be wider interest when
Hmm.
this uh, process continues, a wider interest to start taxing the corporations across the board. So countries are that have been had lowered their taxes in order to attract firms, then may be encouraged to continue to impose some taxes that are suggested by leading countries. For example, the
Hmm.
US, the pressure may build up that it negotiates with other countries a common tax and enforces it.
Mhm. So we have a couple of really good questions in the chat. Ing is asking whether AI will continue to increase or narrow the economic gap between developed and developing countries. How do you think AI might contribute to that divergence in countries' economic performance? Is it likely to narrow it, or is it likely to actually increase it?
My 2 cents, I think, is going to increase the difference for quite some time, because
Mhm.
investing in AI in developing countries, in low-income countries, is very difficult. It's
Mhm.
really capital intensive, extremely
Mhm.
capital intensive. And that is something that can be afforded only in the US and China and a few other economies that are
Mhm.
very strong.
Yeah.
Most countries don't have that kind of resources to have their own AI. At the AI that performs at the levels that the AI systems in the US do.
Mhm. Thank you. And so, Sumya, do you want to voice out your question? It's an excellent question.
Sure. First of all, professors, thank you for today's webinar. It's been such a good learning experience. So I am curious. We mentioned earlier, both of you mentioned earlier that with similar technological onsets earlier, the productivity gains have been higher versus the rise in income.
Mhm.
So if I think of it from the perspective of like an average person in the society, right? Imposing these taxes on the final goods for the consumer, wouldn't that have a detrimental effect? Like, wouldn't it be more expensive for society in general um, if these taxes are imposed on our final product or services?
Mm. It's a good question. And let me try to answer some of it first, and then I'll ask Hadi to give his thoughts. So think about that because sort of like the prices are not static, right? If the idea here is that what we expect to see is a decrease in prices of many goods and services that are AI assisted, right? Then imposing tax on them does not necessarily mean that the overall price compared to what it was before is going to be higher. It potentially could be lower, even including this tax, right? And so, sort of let me give you an example. So of course, I'm an economist. I should practice what I preach. From the consumer perspective, I tell my students that you should renegotiate your contracts often, right? If you are, you need to potentially price out your home and car insurance every year and not rely just on paying the higher bill that the company sends to you. Because those companies using their AI tools kind of like figure out who is more likely to switch and who is less likely to switch and price those things accordingly, right? Last week I figured out, I'll, haven't shopped my automotive insurance for a few years, and I was shocked to figure out that I actually was able to cut for the same level of policy, I was able to cut my premiums by 50%, right? So, and from this perspective, think about, a good AI tool telling consumer, basically doing the negotiation for the consumer themselves, right? Sort of like those friction costs of renegotiating contract decreased, considerably. You're looking at lower spending on many goods and services. And so even if you apply the tax to that, right, overall your spending is still lower. So from that perspective, it could work. I mean, you could probably figure out there will be scenarios where, sort of what you're describing could be true. And that's why, when they were talking about that, they were talking about the mix in policies that will take some burden of consumption, of taxation away from labor. It will place it more in consumption. And because consumption taxes very often tend to be regressive, so it becomes an equity issue. A poorer person pays a higher percentage of their income in consumption taxes compared to a rich person. So we could also figure out a way maybe to make those consumption taxes a little more progressive by saying, okay, you're going to exempt the first $10,000 in consumption from those taxes, right? But everything else is going to be subject to that. There could be increasing rates. So there could be ways to deal with that. But, part of it too is that they'll probably have to tax. It's the idea of maybe taxing the extraordinary economic profits more, right? So this could be a part of solution there too. Hadi?
Not much to add. You've said it well.
All right, good deal. Okay. Anything else? Any other questions or thoughts? All right. Okay. Well, thank you very much, folks. I appreciate your joining us. If you have any suggestions for future topics, let us know. I think as of June, we are going back to our typical schedule of meeting on every second Sunday of the month. So our next meeting is going to be on Sunday, June 14th. We hope to see you there, or to hope that you'll be able to watch the recording. I'll do my best to post this recording to the YouTube today so that others can see it as well. And as always, thanks very much for being a part of this group. It's much appreciated. We love the opportunity of being connected to you even after graduation. Thanks all.
Thank you.
Professors.
Thank
Thank
you.
you,
Thank you.
professors.
Bye-bye now.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.